Hi, you are in the ladies' room with Dr. Donica, the only public ladies' room you can enter anytime without ever waiting online. I'm your host, Dr. Donica Moore. We'll be having real conversations with real women about really intimate issues. They may be embarrassing, sad, or funny, but they will always be interesting and informative. You know, like the best conversations you've had in ladies' rooms with your best friends, or total strangers and a physician. Please join us. Hello, and welcome to another episode of In the Ladies' Room with Dr. Donica. Today, we're going to deal with a rough subject, so I'm just warning you. But this was actually inspired by the NRA, if you can believe it. I got very offended when they issued a statement to physicians that we need to stay in our lane about gun violence. This is our lane. So we're going to do several episodes in the upcoming weeks about this. Now, why? Well, it seems that just about every day we hear about another mass shooting in the United States. That's because there's nearly one per day, depending on how you define it. The date we're taping this podcast interview is the 113th day of 2019. So far, there have been 110 mass shootings in the United States. This week is also the 20th anniversary of the Columbine shooting, which was April 20th, 1999. And it's widely considered a watershed moment in the public view of school shootings, in which 12 students and one teacher were massacred by two shooters in Littleton, Colorado. Since then, we've had numerous other school massacres, and many of us are familiar with the death tolls. What we're not as familiar with are the people who survived. What we're not as familiar with is that more than 226,000 children at 233 schools have been exposed to gun violence, according to the school shooting database maintained by the Washington Post. These shootings killed 143 students and teachers and injured 294 others. There were also over 25 school shootings in 2018 alone. Now, our guest today is Dr. Jaclyn Schildkraut. She's the co-author with Glenn Muschert of the new book, Columbine, 20 Years Later and Beyond. She's the Associate Professor of Criminal Justice at the State University of New York at Oswego. And her research focuses on school and mass shootings in the United States in regard to crime statistics, media representations, security and prevention, legislative responses, and other important considerations that impact individuals and communities struck by these tragedies. Her first book, Mass Shootings, Media, Myths, and Realities, was published in 2016 and may need an update. Dr. Schildkraut prides herself in providing an honest and genuine account of these events and their impact, and is grateful for having had the opportunity to work with communities impacted by these events, including individuals from Columbine, Virginia Tech, Sandy Hook, and many others. She's also a former resident of Orlando, which, as we know, experienced its own horrific mass shooting at the Pulse nightclub in 2016. She's committed to helping change the narrative about these events and encouraging a proactive approach to safety and prevention, and we want to hear all about that today. Welcome to the Ladies' Room, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I wish we had a more pleasant topic of conversation.
Yeah.
And there's no other way to begin this than to dive right in.
Okay.
When I asked you, I think the first question I asked you when we were chatting was, what made you decide to become a specialist in mass shootings? And I think you said, I didn't pick it.
It kind of found me. I had spent a lot of years kind of trying to figure out my path in life and, doing what I think a lot of kids do when they get to college and, partying and testing the waters and, just really trying to figure out what I was supposed to do with my life. Because at that point at, 17 years old, 18 years old, I had no idea. And, I ended up leaving school and spending some time working in the mall. And then I got into real estate and Virginia Tech happened. And somehow I just was sort of like, okay, this is what I meant to do. And the next, the day after, a couple months after the shooting, I went back to the university that I had left and said, please let me back in. And they did. And the rest is history.
So when we say Virginia Tech happened, remind everybody what happened at Virginia Tech and what year are we talking about?
So Virginia Tech happened actually April 16th of 2007. So they just had their 12-year anniversary last week, right before Columbine. And on that particular day, a senior at the school went into one of the dormitories and he killed 2 people. And then 2 hours later, he went into the school's engineering building and he killed 30 additional people. In addition to the 32 people he killed that day, 23 others were injured. And it really sort of changed the way we looked at school safety at the college setting, as well as, of course, we've been considering it at sort of the primary and secondary school level with Columbine.
Well, and at the primary school level with Newtown, Connecticut. I think what is shocking to me as somebody who hasn't really spent a lot of time reviewing mass shootings is that just doing a very cursory reading about this and reading some of the articles that were discussing these various shootings, we now have to specify which was the quote unquote deadliest high school shooting and which was the deadliest college shooting and which was the deadliest primary school shooting, because we have to break it down because it's just overwhelming. So let's start at the very beginning with just definitions. What is the definition of a mass shooting?
Well, that actually depends on who you ask. There are a lot of data sources out, and I think some of the statistics you quoted earlier might have been from the Gun Violence Archives database. And, really it depends on what organization you're looking at, sort of who's doing the defining. The Gun Violence Archive counts any incident where 4 or more people are shot, regardless whether they die or not, which certainly has its merits because we've seen previous definitions exclude make it where you had to have 4 or more fatalities. And, where that was really problematic is if you look at something like the Thurston High School shooting back in 1998, there were 2 people who were killed, but there were 25 others who were injured. And so if you're looking at that 4 fatality requirement, then that theoretically wouldn't count as a mass shooting, even though 27 people had been shot. But on the same token, where that particular definition becomes a little problematic is it doesn't really count context or circumstances around the shooting. So in that instance, it's treating things like familicides or gang shootings or other types of similar events in the same vein as something like Columbine or like Parkland or like Virginia Tech. And the reality is that while gun violence is certainly an issue that needs to be addressed in this country, we have to take into account the context. In fact, we would be remiss not to take into account the context, because the reality is that these shootings are qualitatively different from one another. And if we don't account for those differences,
we've had lots of dogs on our podcast. For those of us for people who are just listening on iTunes, please introduce us to your dog.
Oh, that was Bailey. We also have Chloe and Bella. They're like running around here.
We're very tolerant in the ladies' room. We take all comers. We've had children who've wandered into interviews. We've had dogs.
Well, they all are women, so they're female dogs, so they're in good company.
We've even allowed men into the ladies' room, believe it or not, in special circumstances. We feel that we can use their men's room at theaters and big events where there's not enough ladies' room space. They can come into our podcast every now and then.
But what I was just kind of just kind of wrapping up there was basically at the end of the day, if we don't address those qualitative differences, then we're not going to find legitimate solutions, because you don't plug all the holes at once. You plug one hole and then you move to the other hole, or you can work on them simultaneously, but the holes are different sizes, they're different shapes, and they're going to need different kinds of plugs. And I think we really don't talk about gun violence that way. We try to just lump sum it, and that's kind of been a problem.
All right. So from my perspective, as a physician, I see this as a public health emergency. So I feel like we do need more women involved because we tend to be better at multitasking, and we do need to plug all of these holes at once. But tell us why is it important to view these different types of homicides, whether it's gang violence versus random violence versus a random school shooting massacre versus domestic? Why does it matter what the root cause is?
Well, because at the end of the day, the causes are going to, determine the motivation, and the motivation is going to determine the strategy, and then the strategy is going to determine the response. I mean, the reality is if we look at a lot of the types of violence, for instance, familicide or gang violence, right? These tend to be much more spontaneous events, whereas we know with mass shootings, they're meticulously planned events. So even that, difference alone really means that we're trying to plug two different types of holes. And so that's why we have to take into account those differences in order to find the right solutions.
Okay, so the one word you didn't mention in terms of mass shootings was terrorism. And it seems that we all seem to be very obsessed with terrorism and terrorist attacks. But of these mass shootings, particularly of the school shootings, was that a factor?
When we think about terrorism, the way it's typically connotated in American society, when you say the word terrorism, you think of 9/11. And if you were born before 2000, you think of Oklahoma City in 1995 or the Centennial Park bombing in 1996 in Atlanta. We don't think of shootings or as public mass shootings technically as terrorism. What's really interesting is that in one of the journals of one of the Columbine killers, he had actually written about taking a plane and flying it into buildings in New York City several years before 9/11 even happened. So in that kind of line of thinking, why are we not calling them terrorists? But I think that we also as a general society have a different connotation of what terrorism looks like. And I think in many respects, we think of terrorism as Middle Eastern persons of color with brown skin. And so when you're talking about, suburban white teenagers, it doesn't really evoke the same line of thinking that 9/11 does. And I think that's where we've seen a sort of hesitancy among the public to say, let's talk about it like terrorism.
Yeah, and I think we've started in the media, and I love the fact that your first book was about, debunking issues in the media and focusing on how the media covers this. Unfortunately, even though the book was only written in 2016, it may be time for a second edition because so much has changed in just these past couple of years in terms of how we cover it. But I really appreciate the fact that you're not naming any of these shooters. And I did hear a talk that Anderson Cooper had given many years ago, talking about how he has always refused to name any of the shooters because we certainly don't want to glorify or elevate it. What I want to get to with you is this issue of the people who were not killed, because this is the thing that's really bugging me. Again, depending on what statistics you look at, what are we talking about? 33,000 plus people in the United States per year are killed by gunshot wounds. And the first thing that gun advocates will always say, oh yeah, but 15,000 of them were suicides. So we can't count suicides. Well, yeah, we can count suicides because if those people didn't have a gun, they wouldn't kill themselves. And a person who has a gun in their home has an immediate family member that's 12 times more likely to die of a gunshot wound just by virtue of having a gun in your house, regardless of any other factors. But what I want to talk about are the survivors. What I want to talk about I want to call this sort of beyond the death toll. I want to look at the effect, and this really struck me because I was giving a talk on vitamin supplements in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, a couple of weeks ago, and I got a weird question, or let's just say an unusual question that I had never gotten before. And at this point in my career, I feel like when I get a question I haven't been asked before, that makes me pay attention. And the woman asked me about the role of particular vitamins and supplements in treating PTSD. So I answered the question appropriately for the audience, but I made a point of talking to her one-on-one afterwards because I just felt like, okay, there's more to this question. And I said, was this a hypothetical question or are we talking about a real person with PTSD? And she kind of laughed, this awkward, uncomfortable laugh, and said, my whole family has PTSD. And I said, okay, why? And it turns out that 2 of her children were students at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School who witnessed the Parkland shooting. They were not shot, they were not killed, but they are now living with this trauma. And of course, she and her husband are living with this trauma. And the other healthy children who were not there are living with this trauma. So talk to me about long-term sequelae of not just people in Columbine, but we could use that as an example because obviously that's the area that you have most closely studied and written about recently.
So, and it's interesting because in addition to, going to school in Orlando, I actually grew up in the Parkland area. And so, seeing on the 2-month anniversary, sort of what that landscape looked like was very different than spending time in Columbine, where they've had 20 years to kind of sort of navigate this new normal. And I think what we don't think about when we talk about, mass shootings are the invisible wounds, right? We talk about the people who were killed and, we will certainly acknowledge their family members and the people who have lost in that respect. And we, of course, talk about the people who are injured and who survived because you can see the scars. There was, I believe it was the New Yorker, but I don't remember the exact publication where Anthony Borges, who was a student who used his body as a shield at Parkland, he was shot 5 times and he went on to this newspaper or magazine cover shirtless to show the physical scars of what the bullets did to him. And of course, that was very powerful when you think about a 16-year-old kid who has basically been ripped to shreds. But those are the wounds that are very easy to treat. And when I say easy, I don't mean it like, oh, it's not a big deal, but you can see it, you can diagnose it, you can understand it, you can figure out which direction the bullet went in so you know which is the best way to, fix that hole. But it's not as easy to do that with the emotional scarring that comes from these events. And, PTSD is only one of the factors that these individuals, suffer with. There are individuals who suffer with eating disorders and drug abuse. And, certainly it's only been about 14 months since Parkland happened, so there hasn't been enough time to really develop sort of these long-term consequences. But we've already started to see inklings that those are developing with the fact that 2 students committed suicide. And that actually really took me back to Columbine because I thought about Greg Barnes. And Greg was a star basketball student who was in the school on the day of the shooting. He was in a science room and Greg was not physically injured, but he watched Dave Sanders get shot. And then Dave Sanders, when he crawled into a science room, happened to crawl into the room that Greg was in. And so Greg not only watched him get shot, but then Greg watched him die. And, subsequently, about a year after the massacre, Greg took his own life. And shortly after that, then one of the students who was shot, her mother committed suicide. And so, of course, we've seen most recently in terms of parents, we saw Jeremy Richmond, whose daughter Abiel was killed in Sandy Hook. And we don't, it's very easy to put on that facade of I'm doing okay, I'm doing advocacy, I'm taking care of myself kind of thing. But when those scars are invisible, you don't really see them as much.
Well, and we also heard there was another young girl who recently killed herself, who was a Parkland survivor. It's interesting. You mentioned about the young man who showed his wounds. I was just talking to a young woman who was shot several times in Philadelphia, and she was survived. And she has numerous medical problems. We also think that the people who survived, I know you made the comment, very superficially about it being easy to fix the physical wounds. As a doctor, I can tell you it's not that easy.
Right.
But also it's not, once they're fixed, they're fixed.
Correct.
People go on to have long-term disabilities and difficulty walking and difficulty going to the bathroom. And some of them can't walk. And some of them, have to go through horrific repeated surgeries and be on medications for the rest of their lives. And this one young woman I was talking to said when her clothes are on, you can't see any of her wounds, but she can't walk very far, and she, has difficulty breathing, and she's, don't worry about Bailey.
That's actually Chloe.
Let her just participate. And for everybody who's listening, that's the squeaking noise you hear in the back. And Bailey is a very large dog.
Oh, this is actually Chloe.
Oh, sorry. I confused Chloe and Bailey. But anyway, so this young woman has a handicap parking sticker. And she tells the story about how she was confronted in a parking lot by somebody who thought she was inappropriately using her handicap sticker. And she said, I just wanted to take my shirt off right then and there and, and then have this person say something to me.
Absolutely.
So, the wounds are really, really pervasive and extensive. But one of the other things you and I have talked about are the wounds in the people who were not there and who were not shot, but are having, and who didn't have somebody in their family, but either they were the first responders or they were the doctors in the emergency room. I'm still haunted by a woman I took care of over 25 years ago who was shot in my hospital, and I don't know what happened to her after I took care of her. Tell me about your personal experiences with this as a researcher.
As a researcher, I spend a lot of time in, with survivors and with individuals who have been impacted in some way, shape, or form. For me, when we talked and I said this, before Pulse happened, it was really easy to compartmentalize because you recognized, okay, a shooting's happened, I sort of know how this is going to unfold for me. My phone's going to start ringing. I'm going to have to do press interviews, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so it was very easy to put the feelings that I had in a container or in that compartment and just say, I'll deal with it later. And I did eventually. But when Pulse happened, that really sort of just shattered all of those abilities for me. I can remember, I woke up to the news of the shooting and my phone buzzing to the point of where now today, when the phone buzzes like that excessively, which it did also after Las Vegas, I get really bad PTSD and I get taken back to the morning I found out about Pulse. But that particular day, I did, of course, the phone started ringing and I had to do the press interviews and that lasted a few hours. And then it was like, okay, I've got to check on my friends and I've got to make sure everybody's okay. And praying that nobody I know is dead and calling back home a lot. And then after that, I just sort of sunk into the corner of my room and I cried for 3 days. I went into this sort of state of shock that I didn't sleep for 3 days. I wouldn't go around my house if every single light in my house wasn't on. Nobody had been in the guest bedroom of my house, but I kept touching the doorknob as if it were like hot and like looking because I could have sworn shooters were in my guest room. I know that's super weird and it doesn't even make any sense, but in those moments of trauma, you don't make sense and it seems very rational to you. And I was really fortunate at the time because I had literally met Frank DeAngelis, who was Columbine's principal 3 months earlier. And, you want to talk about one of the most amazing human beings that has ever walked this planet, it is Frank. And, only knowing me for a very short time, I just did not know where to go. And I reached out to him and I said, I don't know anyone that can help me besides you. And he was wonderful and, really kind of talked to me about it. And, we talked about trauma and counseling and all of that. And I sort of, in retrospect, and I love Frank, we're very close. In retrospect, I kind of guessed him to death at that point because I wasn't going to acknowledge what I was dealing with. And then last year, when Parkland happened, it was like, okay, I had this crack in sort of my, veneer or my armor, and then Parkland just blew it apart. And, to the point of where, and it, the media attention that I got after that shooting, not only as a researcher, but also as somebody who grew up in that community, it was, whereas Pulse was several hours and Vegas was maybe a week, I was getting media cover calls for about 7 weeks to the point of where I didn't want to talk to anybody. Like I was just nasty to people. And I had sort of those same irrational thoughts. I actually can remember I flew to Vegas the morning after the to New Orleans the morning after the shooting for a conference. And I literally was on the phone with my mentor in tears
After the Parkland shooting.
After Parkland, yeah. And I was on the phone with my mentor, who's actually Glenn Muschert. And I said, Glenn, I got to quit my job. And he goes, what are you talking about? And I said, well, it keeps finding me. I said, first it was Orlando. And then one of the people I grew up with was actually at the concert in Las Vegas. And fortunately, she escaped unharmed. Still, of course, has those psychological scars. I said, and now Parkland, I said, SUNY Oswego's next. He's like, okay, you need to go to sleep and calm down. This isn't real. But you don't have those really rational thoughts. And then, after the shooting, or the media attention kind of calmed down, I had to unfortunately go right back into working on the Columbine book. And, it was something that we had a year basically to write this book. And the book is really important to me because it was my way of giving back to the community that has really in the last 3 years given me so much. And I spent about 2 months solidly writing this book 16 hours a day. And I've seen a lot. I've been exposed to a lot. I've been in the school a couple of times. And I actually was out in Denver last summer, and we were supposed to go in the school. And I looked at Frank and I said, I can't go in that school. I said, I will literally have a meltdown. At that point, I had started talk therapy, trauma therapy, because I recognized, okay, Frank is right. I got to get some help. And when I came back from Denver and I finished the book, I went to my therapist and I said, I really appreciate everything that you've done. It's not working. At that point, I was having such vivid nightmares that I was getting shot every night, and I would wake up and I'd check myself for bullet holes, and I'd make sure there wasn't blood all over my bed because it felt like blood was pouring out of my body. And I've actually really never told this to many people, but, I had to escalate my therapy because, it's funny. Frank always says to me, he goes, I don't know how you do it. We had one really bad day. He goes, you're exposed to it every single day. And I always kind of scoff at that, because I'm like, I'm not a survivor the way that you are. I was like, I wasn't shot at, and he goes, no, but you were exposed to way more than we ever will be. And that's, as I said to you when we first talked, I said, one of the most important things to me, and I think one of the things that has benefited me the most, is finding a place among survivors who I can go to when I have these moments of things that seem very irrational, and I can talk to people who get it, because it's, it's real to them too.
So did you start medication therapy as well?
No, I have not done medication therapy. I'm currently doing hypnotherapy, and the next step, if this doesn't really kind of sort of level it out, would be Emdr.
Okay, and explain to people what EMDR is.
I think I know that a lot of survivors really swear by it. I know it's eye movement desensitization, something with an R. But I think it has to do with kind of, trying to confront your trauma in a more healthy way. And I know it's sort of next level hypnotherapy. I'm personally not entirely familiar with it, but that's what's been recommended in my course of therapy.
Okay. And I don't want to get too personal,
No, that's okay.
But have you considered medication, or you're just against medication, or your doctor didn't recommend it?
It's not something that we've kind of addressed at this point. I'm not opposed to anything, because the reality for me is that, as hard as it is to do this, especially, where it seems to feel more personal by the day, I can't imagine doing anything else, because, I feel this sense of protection over survivors, because there is, unfortunately, as you mentioned when we first started, this kind of exploitation of people by the media. And I feel like, one of the things I struggle with, and this was really a struggle after Parkland, was I wish there was a way I could take one bullet and bring everybody back. And it eats at me, because, I know that it's not my job to stop these events, but that doesn't mean in my heart I don't want to. And so for me, it's just never been a consideration to ever give up on this. So what we're really working on is what's the best course of treatment that will make me be able to do this for the long haul. And that for me is learning to get, really to a place of mindfulness, of remembering to breathe, because I tend to get so, escalated and elevated. It's certainly, again, not out of the realm of consideration, but right now I'm trying to go this different route, because therapy, is definitely something that has been recommended to me by a lot of survivors, and, they've found it really helpful. And honestly, to date, I've found it really helpful.
So, how in the beginning we talked about how with solving the problem of gun violence, we have to plug a lot of holes at the same time. And we do that in therapy also, in any kind of medical therapy. People instinctively feel like they have to choose one from column A or one from column B, or maybe two from column B. We actually have to do all the things that help. So I just recommend that you talk to your doctor about that, next time. And I know, unfortunately, we have a very limited amount of time today because of your busy schedule. But I would be remiss if I didn't, get you to talk about what you see are some of the immediate approaches to solutions. What are your recommendations for communities now? And of course, it always becomes much more urgent to those of us who have been personally exposed, or as you talk about, when it hits your hometown, that you thought that could never happen, or when it hits a place you were living in. So talk to us about strategies, and it doesn't have to just be about school shootings. Talk to us about what your recommendations are. If you could talk to any legislator right now, anybody running for president, anybody running for town council or school board, what's the recommendation?
Well, it's funny you asked that because my next call is with our legislator here.
Good. This is practice.
No, I think, well, there's a couple things. Number one, and I think that this conversation has sort of alluded to it, I think that we need to put more resources into mental health, not even just in response to these tragedies, but before these tragedies ever happened. And I was reading an article that Max Schachter shared a little bit earlier today, and Max is, his son Alex was killed in Parkland, and Max has really, taken on an advocacy role, as many parents do in his situation. But it was like looking at one of the organizations that provides mental health support to the Parkland community had been given like $75 million or something like that, and basically gave the shooter, prior to the shooting, this sort of really archaic type of, recommendations about how to deal with his own depression and his feelings, like watch a movie, take a walk kind of thing. And I don't think that we can really brush off mental health with such simplistic solutions. Again, addressing the problem before it escalates to a mass shooting or any type of gun violence certainly is problematic.
What about asking people who are being treated for depression for any cause if they have guns in their home?
Absolutely. And that's one of the things that we've really seen post Parkland that I am proud of, and I hope that more states get on board with, which is the extreme risk protection order that, people can either, give up on give their weapons up themselves and, temporarily and say, I'm not in a place to have this gun, or people who are concerned can also make that call to law enforcement. My state here in New York, they just passed it. I know Florida passed it. And Connecticut has it. A number of other states are, kind of getting on board. I think 9 states right now have it. But as you mentioned, having a gun in the home really increases that likelihood, and not only of homicide, but also of suicide. And so I think, when we look at this conversation about depression and about mental health, I think we really have to kind of say, where's the issue, right? Because we know, for instance, that suicide is the leading cause of death, or third leading cause of death rather, among kids 10 to 21. So why are we not having a more serious conversation about that? The other thing that I would really take away or suggest besides mental health resources and conversations is really kind of looking at the lessons that we've learned from previous events and not just sticking your head in the sand and not making the changes that have been identified. One of the most simplistic things that we can do, and I know it sounds like I'm just, whitewashing this, is to say, let's put locks on the door and that can secure from the inside. And we knew that that was a problem in Sandy Hook.
In schools?
In schools, or really even in workplaces or anywhere, right? We know that door locks are the number one life-saving device in a mass shooting because they create a time barrier. Shooters are looking for easy targets, people that they don't really have to work for. And we know from like Columbine, for instance, they had free run of the school for 50 minutes and never tried to breach a locked door. And, now that shootings are over in 5 minutes or less, that door lock becomes even more important. But you look at some place like Sandy Hook, a model that did everything right. Really, they practiced and they knew their drills and they knew how to respond. And that saved a lot of lives that day. But what also was really problematic is they couldn't lock their doors from the interior of the room. And the number one recommendation to come out of the Sandy Hook Advisory Commission report was just put locks on doors that can be secured from the interior. Then you go to something like Parkland, same problem 6 years later. Similarly,
after Parkland, we heard a situation where there was a teacher who had the door barricaded, but opened the door to let in students who were in the hallway. I think what's also interesting, and I find myself that I just did that just then, is that anytime we have a recommendation that will help in a potential situation, our immediate instinct is to come up with all the examples of all the situations in which that would have had no bearing on the situation.
But in reality, first of all, I commend Scott Beigel. I mean, he was a hero. That was the teacher that you were referencing. And I think that, that's not saying that the door lock didn't work. And I have this conversation with teachers all the time when I tell them, lock the door, get away from it, and don't come back to it. And their response to me is always, well, what if there's a kid in the hall? And I always have to say to them, listen, I can't tell you what to do because I don't know what it's like. I mean, I do, but I don't. I don't know how I would react if I was in that situation. And your first instinct as a teacher is to be a caregiver. So your first instinct might be to open that door. And maybe the circumstances going on around you permit you to be able to do that in a safe way where you can get kids into your room. And maybe it doesn't. There's 9,999 things that are going to happen in a shooting. I can't predict them all. So you have to use the tools we give you to make those decisions. So it's not that the door lock failed. It's that Scott opened the door because he really believed he could save kids.
No, that's what I'm saying is that so despite that, I even remember when my own daughter was at American University just starting out, and the head of security gave a presentation to the parents. And it horrified me that this was even on the agenda. But he wanted to assure us that they had this, great security where with the pressing of a single button, they could lock down every single building on campus and the kids inside the buildings would be safe. And so I said, well, what if my kid isn't in the building at the time? Right. So anyway, we just have a couple of more minutes before you have to go. Please tell us about the foundation to which you're donating all of the proceeds from your book, which I think is extremely generous and wonderful of you.
So we donated all of the royalties from the Columbine book to the Columbine Memorial Foundation. I think it was about 8 years after the shooting, there was a permanent memorial erected in Clement Park, which is just adjacent to the school. And it is really, I spent a lot of time there. I've had some very sort of really weird spiritual moments there, and weird in a positive way, where it's just, you really kind of get things in life called into question for you. But it's really a place of honoring the victims, of, honoring the community, and of keeping the memories of these individuals and, the impact, alive, because the reality is that the minute we choose to forget is the minute we don't learn. And so, we really wanted to give back, Glenn and I, in a way that would be very meaningful. And we wanted to do our part to help ensure that that the memorial would be there for generations to come. So anybody who does purchase a book, anyone who does purchase a book, their purchase is going to a amazing cause.
And of course, the book Columbine is available on Amazon and where all retailers where books are sold. Last sentence, one message that you want everybody who's listening to think about and take action on. One action point.
One action point would be hold your media accountable. We have got to stop glorifying these killers. We have to stop rewarding them for killing, and we need to honor the victims, the heroes, and the legacies that come out of that day. We've given too much attention to the people who take and not enough attention to the people who give.
I think that's an awesome, awesome message. And the only thing I would add to that is hold your legislators accountable as well. You've got to get on a phone call with your legislator. And so I think the action point I want to give everybody is get on the phone with your own legislators and talk about how this has to be a top priority issue. Thank you so much for the work you do. And thank you so much for making the time to talk to us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Take care.
That's all we have time for today. But let's keep the conversation going on Twitter or Facebook at Dr. Donica. And please join us next week for another episode of In the Ladies' Room with Dr. Donica. Real conversations with real women about really intimate topics.